Well, hi. Trying to think what I would say in 5 to 6 minutes. No, it's an interesting thing. My research is in the area of forgiveness, and it began because of two reasons. One, because I myself was very badly hurt. And none of the therapeutic skills that I had been taught were of any use. And I did the things that like therapists do, and I emoted and I blamed, and I did all the stuff, and I wrote letters, and didn't send them, and all the therapist stuff. But it wasn't effective. And it was only when I opened to the quality of forgiveness in myself did things really shift and change. So that was part of the motivation for trying to do research on forgiveness. The second was, and this is the relationship to this group. I had a very strong belief at that time, and this was before positive psychology showed up and was able to prove that many of the things that we actually believe have empirical value. But I really believe that for spiritual qualities to be true, they had to be true on the most mundane, tangible, physical sense. That if they were ethereally true, but physically not true, they weren't true. And so I set out to do, this was before anybody was doing this stuff, almost 20 years ago, an empirical study, randomized controlled study, that people who were hurt, who learned to forgive, would be healthier if they forgave. And it just struck me as that was the necessary use of science in terms of furthering understanding of spiritual qualities. Because I was never comfortable with people saying, well, you can't know, or I know it's true, but I can't prove it, or it's true only from a certain point of view, or you have to have the consciousness before you can understand it. None of that satisfied me. Again, because I had a very simplistic notion that, I don't know how to put this, that I guess goodness, which was distilled spirit, had to be health enhancing, and had to be relationship enhancing, and had to be nurturing in ways that could be measured. And if it proved out to be not so, then, I remember the Dalai Lama saying, if science disproves Buddhism, then I give up Buddhism. It's like, because what am I going to do if the laws of nature, which are measurable, also say this is wrong? Then I'm going to have a little bit harder time. Thankfully, my research showed that forgiveness was good for you. Otherwise, I would have had more psychic confusion than I actually have. And the last thing that I will say was just that I did, in my time being a researcher at Stanford's medical school, I did about 6 or 7 studies on showing that the forgiveness methodology that I developed was helpful for people's well-being, both emotional, physical, and relational. And it made a difference in people with blood pressure problems, and it made a difference with people with, other kinds of physical issues. And it worked on depression and stress and anxiety. And it also had a modest effect on other spiritual qualities. Now that work is mainstream, but when I did it almost 20 years ago, it was unusual. So thank you.
Hello everybody, it's really an honor to be here. I'm an ITP alumni. I came to the US in 2006. I'm a clinical psychologist from Germany. Fred was one of my mentors at ITP, so I feel really honored to sit next to Fred on this panel, although it's a little bit difficult to speak after Fred, so I hope I can deliver something here. I'm for more than 20 years, I'm a clinical psychologist and body psychotherapist in Germany, and 2004, I survived the Asian tsunami in Thailand, had a near-death experience, came back to life, and received this calling that I should work on body-centered healing practices after such experiences of trauma. And that's why I decided to come to the US and to study transpersonal psychology in addition to clinical psychology. So I specialized here in transpersonal research. After being such a long-term practitioner, I found really passion for research, and I feel like in the second half of my life I just really wanted to dedicate a lot of time to research. So I would call my research practice-based research. It really comes out of my wealth and value of 20 years of clinical work. I'm specialized in working with all kinds of trauma, and my core concept is embodiment. So I have the understanding and also the experience of healing with my clients, that everything goes through the body, everything is memorized in the body, everything is connected through the body. We connect with ourselves through the body and also with the world and the cosmos. So after my own experience of disaster and also working through my own healing of trauma after this disaster, what was the other thing that really shattered my life after the tsunami was that I thought there when I was standing in mass destruction in Thailand, what should I do with one-on-one psychotherapy? I just felt really ridiculous as a clinical psychologist. So that shifted my work tremendously, that I want to look for community-oriented approaches to healing and kind of inexpensive approaches, because what I realized also the people, the poor people there will not really receive any help or any money. So I dedicated my life to try to help devastated communities after disaster also. So I came to ITP, I fell in love with ITP. It's a long-term love relationship, I would say, although I think times have really changed. I follow as much as possible the processes that are going on. But still I'm in love with ITP and the spirit that I received there. I had a deep experience of homecoming, which I feel also is important, like related to passion, or in research, that you have really like a sense of why do you do research and from where is your research coming. So I would say my research is coming from my heart, but really like even deeper, like from a sense of home, a feeling of homecoming. So regarding philosophy and the research method, there's not really time to go into that, but I found my home in embodied phenomenology, because all I was doing as a clinical body psychotherapist was I was able to integrate in this method of qualitative embodied phenomenology, put together by Les Tortres. He was my professor in the UK on my dissertation committee. So he is drawing on Chandlin's experiential philosophy. Everything is connected to the body, and implemented the phenomenology of Heidegger and Gadamer. I will not go into that, I just wanted to point it out. It's a wonderful method, I think, for clinicians who work body-centered. And the other thing I want to point out, my recent project is a film project. So my dissertation was on a trauma program with women at the US-Mexican border who have experiences of different kinds of trauma related to the terrible situation in the borderlands. And I also collected their life stories related to the borderland. They told in very deep detail circumstances about the borderland that I have never told before. And several of my participants asked me that I wished their stories to be heard in the world. So what I took from my research was also that beyond academic discourse and academic publication, it should be accessible for a greater public and also of community service. So I'm trying to make a documentary out of these women's stories. And so this is a goal of reaching out also to community, to global communities, and educate in that way. Okay, thank you.
So thank you to Stephen and to everybody for being here. My name is Giovanna Calabrese and I'm here from Italy. And so speaking about research, I must say that I've always had a very passion for research, and during my medical school I tried to escape all the clinical work as much as I could, and my dissertation was on research, and when I started to study psychiatry, that was the reason why I went to medical school, I still did research. I didn't do any much clinical practice. Then when for many different reasons I came into the transpersonal field, I started to enjoy the clinical practice, and this is because I found it was different. It was not about therapy, but it was to help people to find their inner power of healing themselves. So I kind of enjoyed the clinical practice. But still I'm passionate about research, and actually I found out that research doesn't come before clinical, like I thought when I was in medical school. Research and clinical practice actually go together. I think they really are intertwined between each other. And the way I use now research is, in the transpersonal field, is to do research in clinical practice. And this is, I think it's very important, not just because the mainstream psychology would accept and acknowledge me, even because I'm a psychiatrist, so they wouldn't do it anyway, but it's because it's important. Working in a hospital means helping more people than just doing private clinical practice, and to have the students of the school in Milan to get into the hospital sometimes is difficult because they don't really know what transpersonal psychotherapy is, they don't know what the beer transenergetic is. So I started to do a clinical study on the via transenergetica model, and I used the heuristic approach. This is because the way it works in the clinical practice is very close to the heuristic approach. And it's been quite challenging and actually very exciting also to apply this technique in the clinical study, because coming from the medical field, clinical studies means that you have to use a standard method of therapy. So how can this be done in the transpersonal psychotherapy? That, of course, there is no standard method. And so it's been quite challenging and exciting to adapt the heuristic approach to this field. And what I do also is to teach in the school and try to get the students interested in research and using research in their clinical practice, because I think this is important not just to help them in their practice, but also to have the transpersonal, to have a wider audience for the transpersonal psychotherapy and psychology. And I think this is absolutely important and necessary. So thank you for your attention.
I'd like to, my name's Frank Eckenhofer, and I'd like to follow up with your discussion about heuristic research, because I also use that method myself, and we were talking earlier about adapting it. It's a method that you can adapt, and that's why I like it, because it seems to be, it's a systematic approach to subjective experience, but it has a structure. So I think for transpersonal work, we do need structure. We do need forms they're not going to be perfectly the same with each person, but there is a form that you follow that you can adapt. So I think I've been searching for good measures for transpersonal experience, and heuristic research to me is a very good method. Basically, one of the ideas is you treat the people that typically you would call participants or subjects, you call them co-researchers. So it really levels the kind of authority issues in the research. So that's one dimension I think is really good for transpersonal work. And my research area is in ayahuasca research. And I became fascinated with science and discovery and transpersonal psychology all at the same time. I don't see it, in my mind, there's not a distinction. I know there's a lot of a lot of a sense that there's a polarity and a struggle between these two, but in myself I don't feel it. I love science. I think it's, when used properly, I think it's beautiful, precise, elegant, when applied the right way. It's just, finding the right method. But there's a beauty to science. And so for me, when I first heard about Zen masters having particular brainwave patterns, I mean, this is you've asked this question maybe twice at least, right, at the conference. It was my experience too. I thought, wow, this is so amazing. Zen masters have a particular kind of EEG patterns. This was a study done by Harai in '74 in Kyoto University in Japan. But it was published in Psychology Today, I think in '69. But I was just so struck by that article, that we would have this correspondence between the most advanced Zen practitioners and these physiological measures. And as soon as I saw that study, I knew I wanted to learn EEG technology and I wanted to study Zen, those two things together. And so I did my dissertation using EEG. So I wanted to get a dissertation in psychology, but I wanted to learn the method of EEG. Now it's called quantitative EEG. And I've done a series of studies, both in meditation, but more recently in ayahuasca, and research is in Peru and Brazil. And my goal is to get the best kind of EEG data and the best type of subjective report data, and to really look at those two data sets and to create an atmosphere that's ideal for subjective experience, so the person can have a really very positive transpersonal experience, and also at the same time we can collect good data. So it's quite a challenge, to do those two things. So typically I work with people that are very experienced in taking ayahuasca, and they're also co-researchers, so there'll be people that are also trained in the technology. So it's sort of like people know both worlds. They know the world of ayahuasca and their own practice, their own developmental process, and they're familiar with where they're going. At the same time, they're not unfamiliar with the EEG because they know that part too. So these people are really co-researchers. So for me, that's a really good model when you want to use neuroscience, because if the person is naive to say neuroscience, it's going to be very upsetting to them. It's going to ruin their experience, but not so for if you take this other approach. If they're co-researchers, and they know both sides of the story. The scientific side and the subjective experience side. And I just want to mention one thing, I had two dissertation students that really have affected my current thinking, and I'm planning another study to do in Peru, probably this summer. And this study is going to try to be more expansive and really look at gender differences. I think the two dissertation students I had were both women, and they taught me really in their work that's really important to look at gender differences and transformative experience. So that's going to be one of the goals for the study in Peru. Thank you.
Let me start with the first. That was to say what I've been involved in, just briefly, and I can actually pick up relating to what you've been talking about, because one of the major projects I was involved in recently was a heuristic study. And the point about heuristic study, you said about co-researchers, all that is correct. The other thing is that it places self as a central factor. And of course that, I think, very much characterizes research under the orbit of transpersonal work. So much scientific research, it goes back to what Jim Fadiman was saying before, about the relevance test. Is this really useful? Well, if it's about yourself, yes, it's going to be useful. Maybe it's useful to yourself, but I think if it's about yourself, in a sense, it's useful beyond that, because you're talking about value. Anyway, that's the introduction. So this area is about the nature, the way in which disease becomes sacred. So, sacred illness. What is it when an unfortunate event, some kind of disease or some deformity or whatever it might be, is perceived by that person in sacred terms. And what difference does that make? So it's not a quantitative study and sort of say, well, do they get better more quickly? That's not the question. The question is, what is the value and what is the process that the person goes through in recognizing that something that the rest of the world might think is a terrible disaster actually is playing a crucial role in their life in a transpersonal sense. So that's one area of research. Other areas are non-empirical as well. I think the non-empirical side is equally important. So I'm spending a lot of time looking into textual material in Buddhism, for example, the Abhidharma of the Pali Canon in Buddhism, which focuses a very, very small aspect, but really interesting from the point of psychological research, focusing this literature dating back way back, which is looking at what they call the sense door process, in other words, perception. And so my interest was to look at the way in which these very sophisticated first-person treatises, that obviously in Buddhist material come from intense meditation, the way in which those ideas related to what was coming through in terms of cognitive neuroscience. So which processes in the brain relate to what some ancient Buddhist text is talking about. And these aren't vague texts, these are talking about very precise processes within what we would call the perceptual process. And that's really important. I'm not claiming that my work is important, but what is important is to recognize that science does not operate, as it were, with data alone. We think of the crazy scientists, the EEG, that's the data. But of course, it's not. All that data is filtered through interpretation. And a crucial part of the research endeavor is model building. And when I look into, I talked about the Abhidharma, another main area that I've been writing on research comes from the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and how texts from the 12th century, 13th century are talking about things that we would describe as psychology. And so bringing that material, and it's complex material, you've got to decode it. It's a whole different symbol system, but that's another story in itself. So bringing that in relation to contemporary neuroscience, cognitive science, or ideas of depth psychology, and building those models which help to shape the way in which we interpret the data that we have. So I said that we're running out of time, but the other thing I wanted to say, I'm going to say it in just a few words, but each is a kind of lecture in itself. What is research? And of course we talk about methodology, so we talk about heuristic and so on. But it's not just about methodologies. It's about the structures that we use to explain, explanatory structures. It's about the value we place on transformation. These are the areas that differentiate us from what others might call mainstream science. But once you can formulate what those paradigms are and the parameters involved, you can start to see the relationship between what I might say is transpersonal work and which is another work which may not have that label. So that's what I think a big theme in what I'm saying, I said in the education panel as well. I believe in those bridges. I want to build those bridges and I say I want to build them. I think we have built them and they are there. There's a myth, I'll finish with this, It's a myth that transpersonal psychology is out on a limb from the point of view of from the point of view of sort of mainstream psychology. What is mainstream psychology? Open, go to lectures or whatever is mainstream psychology. We're talking about mindfulness, we're talking about spirituality in health. And it's been said, these are areas that your transpersonal psychology initiated, but we're still engaged. And to build those bridges in terms of the parameters of the research project, that's what I'm involved in.
So we've
panelists decided that maybe you'd like to hear us talk among ourselves about certain questions or also entertain questions from the audience. So are there any questions you'd like us to address for you? Yeah.
Frank, I've heard that people that have taken ayahuasca and didn't know the context of where it came from had spontaneous visions of jaguars, the animal, not the car. Can you corroborate or debunk that? Or?
I'm trying to frame this as a kind of a panel response, so let me just think how to do that. I feel that I don't know. That's my most immediate answers. I really don't know, but I just know that context is very important. And from my own experience, everything I learned showed up in my ayahuasca experiences. All my prior background seemed to be given greater emphasis and attention, something like that. So I think that's true for most people I've talked to. I was curious about maybe if we have any questions for each other.
As I did, my previous research field was in neuroscience, and something that I started to don't like about neuroscience approach is that they make like just a strict correlation. So you have some finding in some part of the brain, and so you think that you found the area of this kind of emotion, or the area maybe of this ayahuasca, or this is the area where you see the jaguar or you don't see the jaguar. So how can you avoid this make it so simple?
I think we were talking about a little bit the value of different types of, there's one type of research where you study one person repeatedly over time. It's kind of a longitudinal study. It's an N of one person over time. And I think in many ways, for certain phenomena, in the beginning, it might be advantageous to just work within one person's experience. So in that way, you can have a hunch when you start to see the first correlation. But then, let's see it again, let's see it again, let's see it again. So it's repeated measures, basically. Do we see this again? Does it keep showing up? Does the phenomenology continue to correspond with the kind of pattern we see in EEG? Right? So that's one method, I think.
Well, yes, but I was wondering about, because many times neuroscience doesn't consider the meaning of the experience.
Yes.
So the inner meaning of the experience is not just that the brain, that area of the brain responds to that stimulus,
Yeah.
but it's the meaning that the stimulus has for the person.
Yes, you may, I'm sure you'll know about phrenology, right? Bumps on the head and everything. And this is 21st century phrenology, what you're talking about. And the issue with phrenology is not only was it scientific, are the bumps of any interest or whatever, but the interesting thing about phrenology are the categories that they regarded as functions. So these phrenological heads. You have a centre for patriotism, a centre for domesticity. Yeah? So these were projections of that age, and we still do it. That's my answer to your question. I mean, another answer to the question is actually there are real challenges raised, especially in relation to functional MRI. I mean, we're conditioned to look at the colours. It is yellow, so that tells me a great deal. Well, that actually, if you understand the computing involved in bringing about that codification, there are some questions that need to be answered. So it's not as clear cut as it seems, and so that my semi-humorous connection with phrenology does have some basis. And I think, finally, the point, absolutely right, totally agree with you. It's about meaning, and that's why I said about these phrenological bumps, do we want to see a centre of patriotism in the brain? That's about meaning, and we create our meaning. The danger is that we create that meaning on the back of neuroscience, because it's so powerful today. We create that meaning in a highly reductive kind of way. And instead of opening up our scale of exploration, we narrow it down. That's the danger.
I think also, let's say, I think the classic shamanic journey experience has a certain structure to it. So some things, like in my work in the ayahuasca, there's a phenomenological process that shows up again and again with different people. So it might, not that it's universal, but clearly you go to another world, you receive knowledge, you may be experiencing a guide, a being that speaks to you, maybe you go through hardship, maybe you're dismembered, eventually you come back, but it has a structure, there's a phenomenological structure. So it's the kind of thing that will arise during a research recording. So if that arises repeatedly, you could be doing EEG while it's happening. You know, it's not, you can't make that happen, but if you work with very experienced people, often it does happen. So there is a strategy where the meaning component has been, to some sense, stabilized, not just by Westerners, but by indigenous people too. So we know we have a phenomenon, that's a real phenomenon. We don't exactly know what it means, but it is a structured phenomenon that's archetypal. So in that sense, we can, if that's arising, we can correlate that with particular patterns. The question is, are there patterns that go along? And that's the question I'd love to answer. You know, whether there are specific patterns, and I suspect there are some changes, there are some major changes in how I think I have some evidence for some of these changes. So it's really, I think science can appropriately use measurements to sort out the phenomenology, but the phenomenology comes first, right? The phenomenology guides the process of research. So I think we just have a minute. So do we also have a time for questions?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing? Yeah, sure.
You know, as somebody who was trained in a major research university to do, you know, clinical trials, what strikes me as so interesting is what it means to hear the results of research. And I know there's a lot of frustration because, you know, results can be contradictory, and, you know, one time, you know, eggs are good for you and then they're bad for you, and, you know, this causes that and that causes this, and what's so challenging is for me to understand that, and for anybody else, it's just the unbelievable complexity of this life. And the methods that we have to examine it are at this point inadequate for any definitive conclusions. And yet, you know, we make small progress, but we would like, I think, because I still do research, we'd like to be more capable than we are. And it's very interesting. So we're still all groping in the dark to some degree. And you know, there's a kind of ironic humility to that. So,
Amen.
what's that?
I said amen to that.
Yeah.
I would like to add also something like, I think it was mentioned several times that it's so important to that we maybe more interconnect and collaborate. So regarding my research method, for example, which is really clearly qualitative, I know Glenn Hartelius' somatic approach in phenomenology, so that could be a mixed method approach or combining it with new phenomenology. So what I feel is also really important that as researchers that we know our neighbors, and you know, that we acknowledge our neighbors, or that we even look how we could collaborate more, because I feel really we just said it in the break, more and more also in the qualitative field, more and more approaches are coming up, so in Korean, so in Korea. So I feel it's probably more important. That would be also a link to the symposium theme, unity within diversity. that we should probably also remember again our common course in research and how we could work together.
I have a question. Earlier, in reference to research, it was said to ask the question, if so, so what? And so when I think about, especially as I'm a student here in my first year, as I approach a dissertation topic and thinking about, okay, what can I possibly ask that there's a really important so what? And I'm thinking about, the idea of being able to demonstrate the human spirit. And so along those lines, I wanted to open up a question of what approaches do you have in mind for approaching the question of, is there a human spirit? And if you have any, your first thoughts, really, let's free associate on the question of what is your thought around research and the human spirit?
The first thing that I would say about this is that, if I consider my previous background in research, is that you can really do research on spirit because, research, the way it was intended for me, especially, let's say, from the quantitative kind of method of research, is not something that you can measure. So it's like, well, you can do research on spirit. It's something. Now I would say that you can do a kind of, what's the meaning of spirit for that person? So you can do research not just to demonstrate that spirit exists or doesn't exist. What's the meaning of spirit?
And does it make a difference? I think that, exactly what you're saying, but I would just add on, does it make a difference? Because we can't research spirit, but we can research the way it makes a difference to people's lives when they incorporate. It's like the example I gave from my own work about how people respond to serious illness, and the person who holds that there's a sacred dimension. It does make a difference. It's also this point that with Fred, with forgiveness, it makes a difference. And I think that will be what you can't be too grand, you can't be too large scale. That's another kind of question. But I think through the, like we're talking about heuristic methods or other methods relevant to the transpersonal, I think that's what it comes down to, is how to, and the point about difference.
And from the heuristic point of view, it comes to you. Like, what is your question about spirit? So first, the inquiry would be toward yourself, to ground it in your own experience. Like, what would you like to know more? And that makes it meaningful because that's where it begins. It begins with us. It begins with our curiosity, our yearning to know. So that's where it's situated in the beginning, and then from there you get more ideas about how to work with it, but it sort of has to begin there. For me, that's a good place for it to begin.
At least the challenge for me has been the gray area between being an advocate and a scientist. And at some level, both are necessary, but if you're going to do research, you have to be willing to have your data disprove you. And otherwise, you're not doing research, you're doing advocacy. And just a small, semi-humorous story from my own work is I was giving a talk at Stanford's medical school, probably 10 years ago, and there were hundreds of people in the auditorium, and I was talking about the health benefits of forgiveness, having done one research project, and I knew that the data for the next research project was just about finished, and it had hundreds of participants, and Like, I'm standing up there talking about the health benefits of forgiveness, knowing that I could be going home to an email that said your study didn't work. And that's I think that's really the only way you can do research. Like, you have to be willing to be disproven. And if you're not, then you're not really, research isn't really the agenda, and it's tough. It's a tough line.